Some learned fables for good old boys and girls in 3 parts. Continuing part first, how the animals of the wood sent out a scientific expedition. Night drew on space. The sentinel crickets were posted. The glowworm and firefly lamps were lighted, and the camp sank to silence and sleep. After breakfast in the morning, the expedition moved on. About noon, a great avenue was reached, which had in it 2 endless parallel bars of some kind of hard black substance, raised the height of the tallest bullfrog above the general level. The scientists climbed up on these and examined and tested them in various ways. They walked along them for a great distance, but found no end and no break in them. They could arrive at no decision. There was nothing in the records of science that mentioned anything of this kind, but at last the bald and venerable geographer, Professor Mudturtle, a person who was born poor and of a drudging low family, had, by his own native force, raised himself to the headship of the geographers of his generation, said, "My friends, we have indeed made a discovery here. We have found in a palpable compact and imperishable state what the wisest of our fathers always regarded as a mere thing of imagination. Humble yourselves, my friends, for we stand in a majestic presence. These are parallels of latitude. Every heart and every head was bowed, so awful, so sublime was the magnitude of the discovery. Many shed tears. The camp was pitched, and the rest of the day given up to writing voluminous accounts of the marvel and correcting astronomical tables to fit it. Toward midnight, a demoniacal shriek was heard, then a clattering and rumbling noise, and the next instant a vast, terrific eye shot by, with a long tail attached, and disappeared in the gloom, still uttering triumphant shrieks. The poor camp laborers were stricken to the heart with fright, and stampeded for the high grass in a body. But not the scientists. They had no superstitions. They calmly proceeded to exchange theories. The ancient geographer's opinion was asked. He went into his shell and deliberated long and profoundly. When he came out at last, they all knew by his worshipping countenance that he brought light. Said he, "Give thanks for this stupendous thing which we have been permitted to witness. It is the vernal equinox." There were shoutings and great rejoicings. "But," said the angleworm, uncoiling after reflection, "this is dead summertime." "Very well," said the turtle. "We are far from our region. The season differs, with the difference of time between the 2 points." "Ah, true enough. But it is night. How should the sun pass in the night? In these distant regions, he doubtless passes always in the night at this hour." "Yes, doubtless, that is true. But being night, how is it that we could see him? It is a great mystery, I grant that, but I am persuaded that the humidity of the atmosphere in these remote regions is such that particles of daylight adhere to the disk, and it was by aid of these that we were enabled to see the sun in the dark." Obviously, this is pointing out how ridiculous it is for people to claim theories about stuff they don't know. I mean, it's certainly to a degree based on what they know, but, people can take it places where... This was deemed satisfactory, and due entry was made of the decision. But about this moment, those dreadful shriekings were heard again. Again the rumbling and thundering came speeding up out of the night, and once more a flaming great eye flashed by and lost itself in the gloom and distance. The camp laborers gave themselves up for lost. The savants were sorely perplexed. Here was a marvel hard to account for, and they thought that they talked, and they talked, and they thought. Finally, the learned and aged lord, Granddaddy Longlegs, who had been sitting in deep study, with his slender limbs crossed and his stemmy arms folded, said, "Deliver your opinions, brethren, and then I will tell you my thought, for I think I have solved the problem." "So be it, good your lordship," piped the weak treble of the wrinkled and withered Professor Woodlouse, "for we shall hear from your lordship's lips naught but wisdom." Here the speaker threw in a mess of threadbare, exasperating quotations from the ancient poets and philosophers, delivering them with unction in the sounding grandeurs of the original tongues, they being from the Mastodon, the Dodo, and other dead languages. Perhaps I ought not to presume to meddle with matters pertaining to astronomy at all. In such a presence as this, I, who have made it the business of my life to delve only among the riches of the extinct languages and unearth the opulence of their ancient lore, but still, as unacquainted as I am with the noble science of astronomy, I beg with difference and humility to suggest that inasmuch as the last of these wonderful apparitions proceeded in exactly the opposite direction from that persuaded by the first, which you decide to be the vernal equinox, and greatly resembled it in all particulars, is it not possible, nay certain, that the last is the autumnal equa... Ooh! Ooh! Go to bed! Go to bed! With annoyed derision from everybody. So the poor old Woodlouse retreated out of sight, consumed with shame. Further discussion followed, and then the united voice of the commission begged Lord Longlegs to speak. He said, "Fellow scientists, it is my belief that we have witnessed a thing which has occurred in perfection but once before in the knowledge of created beings. It is a phenomenon of inconceivable importance and interest. View it as one may, but its interest to us is vastly heightened by an added knowledge of its nature which no scholar has heretofore possessed, or even suspected. This great marvel which we have just witnessed, fellow savants, it almost takes my breath away. It is nothing less than the transit of Venus." Every scholar sprang to his feet, pale with astonishment. Venus is like our Lucifer, as some would call it. Nivga, refer to Daniel. Hallel, refer to Isaiah. Stuff like that. The only planet that can cast a shadow that we can see, right? Then ensued tears, handshakings, frenzied embraces, and the most extravagant jubilations of every sort. But by and by, as emotion began to retire within bounds, and reflection to return to the front, the accomplished Chief Inspector Lizard observed, "But how is this Venus should traverse the sun's surface, not the earth's? The arrow went home, it carried sorrow to the breast of every apostle of learning there, for none could deny that this was a formidable criticism. But tranquilly the venerable Duke crossed his limbs behind his ears and said, 'My friend has touched the marrow of our mighty discovery. Yes, all that have lived before us thought a transit of Venus consisted of a flight across the sun's face. They thought it, they maintained it, they honestly believed it, simple hearts, and were justified in it by the limitations of their knowledge. But to us it has been granted that the inestimable boon of proving that the transit occurs across the earth's face, for we have seen it.' The assembled wisdom sat in speechless adoration of this imperial intellect. All doubts had instantly departed, like night before the lightning. The tumblebug had just intruded unnoticed. He now came, reeling forward among the scholars, familiarly slapping first one and then the other on the shoulder, saying, 'Nice, nice, nice, old boy,' and smiling a smile of elaborate content, arrived at a good position for speaking. He put his left arm akimbo with his knuckles planted in his hip just under the edge of his cutaway coat, bent his right leg, placing his toe on the ground and resting his heel with easy grace against his left shin, puffed out his aldermanic stomach, opened his lips, leaned his right elbow on Inspector Lizard's shoulder, but the shoulder was indignantly withdrawn, and the hard-handed son of toil went to earth. He floundered a bit, but came up smiling, arranged his attitude with the same careful detail as before, only choosing Professor Dogtick's shoulder for a support, opened his lips, and went to earth again. He presently scrambled up once more, still smiling, made a loose effort to brush the dust off his coat and legs, but a small pass of his hand, getting rumbling in the tumble here, missed entirely, and the force of the unchecked impulse slewed him suddenly around, twisted his legs together, and projected him, limber and sprawling, into the lap of the Lord Longlegs. 2 or 3 scholars sprang forward, flung the low creature head over heels into a corner, and reinstated the patrician, smoothing his ruffled dignity with many soothing and regretful speeches. Professor Bullfrog roared out, "No more of this, Sirrah Tumblebug. Say your say, and that get you about your business with speed. Quick, what is your errand? Come, move off a trifle. You smell like a stable. What have you been at? Please, please your worship, I chanced to light upon a find, but no matter about that. There's but ice. Another find, which, beg pardon, your honors, what was that ice thing that ripped by here first? It was the vernal equinox. Ice. Vernal equinox. That's all right. The ice. Don't know him. What's other one? The transit of Venus. Ice. Got me again. No matter lass. One drop something. Ah, indeed. Good luck. Good news. Quick. What is it? Ice. Mosey out. And see. It'll pay. No more votes were taken for 24 hours. Then the following entry was made. The commission went in a body to view the find. It was found to consist of a hard, smooth, huge object with a round summit surmounted by a short, upright projection resembling a section of a cabbage stalk divided transversely. This projection was not solid, but was a hollow cylinder, plugged with a soft, woody substance unknown to our region. That is, it had been so plugged, but unfortunately this obstruction had been heedlessly removed by Norway Rat, chief of the sappers and miners, before our arrival. The vast object before us, so mysteriously conveyed from the glittering domains of space, was found to be hollow and nearly filled with a pungent liquid of a brownish hue, like rainwater that has stood for some time. And such a spectacle as met our view. Norway Rat was perched upon the summit, engaged in thrusting his tail into the cylindrical projection, drawing it out, dripping, permitting the struggling multitude of laborers to suck the end of it. Then, straightway, reinserting it and delivering the fluid to the mob as before. Evidently this liquor had strangely potent qualities, for all that partook of it were immediately exalted with great and pleasurable emotions, and went staggering about, singing ribald songs, embracing, fighting, dancing, discharging eruptions of profanity, and defying all authority. Around us struggled, amassed an uncontrolled mob, uncontrolled and likewise uncontrollable. For the whole army, down to the very sentinels, were mad like the rest, by reason of the drink. We were seized upon these reckless creatures, and within the hour even we were undistinguishable from the rest. The demoralization was complete and universal. And one of the things that they have found with some of intoxicants is that drug-based insanity can actually extend beyond the high. Marijuana, the short-term stuff, I guess you could say the 3 days without, but actually 5 years for your brain to, well, you see what your brain's going to be in terms, because it processes in the fat and whatnot. Coffee, just 5 days without. Tobacco, nicotine, 21 days. 3 months for opiates. Amphetamines can be a year. Some psychiatric medications can be 2 years. But so that's something to consider other than just the high itself. And then there's, permanent effects, you could say. In time, the camp wore itself out with its orgies and sank into a stolid and pitiable stupor, in whose mysterious bonds rank was forgotten and strange bedfellows made, our eyes at the resurrection being blasted, and our souls petrified with the incredible spectacle of that intolerable, stinking scavenger, the tumblebug, and the illustrious patrician, my lord granddaddy, Duke of Longlegs, lying soundly steeped in sleep, and clasped lovingly in each other's arms, the like whereof hath not been seen in all the ages of that tradition compass, and doubtless none shall ever in this world find faith to master the belief of it, save only that we have beheld the damnable and unholy vision. Thus inscrutable be the ways of God, whose will be done. This day, by order, did the engineer-in-chief, Herr Spider, rig the necessary tackle for the overturning of the vast reservoir, and so its calamitous contents were discharged in a torrent upon the thirsty earth, which drank it up, and now there is no more danger. We, reserving but a few drops for experiment and scrutiny, and to exhibit the king and subsequently preserve among the wonders of the museum, what this liquid is, has been determined. It is without question that fierce and most destructive fluid called lightning. It was wrested in its container from its storehouse in the clouds by the resistless might of the flying planet, hurled at our feet as she sped by. An interesting discovery here results, which is that lightning kept to itself is quiescent. It is the assaulting contact of the thunderbolt that releases it from captivity, ignites its awful fires, and so produces an instantaneous combustion, an explosion which spread disaster and desolation far and wide in the earth. After another day devoted to the rest and discovery, some expedition proceeded upon its way. Some days later it went into the camp and in a pleasant part of the plain, and savants sallied forth to see what they might find. The reward was at hand. Professor Bullfrog discovered a strange tree and called his comrades. They inspected it with profound interest. It was very tall and straight and wholly devoid of bark, limbs, or foliage. By triangulation, the Lord Longlegs determined its altitude. Herr Spider measured its circumference at the base and computed the circumference at the top by a mathematical demonstration based upon the warrant furnished by the uniform degree of its taper upward. It was considered a very extraordinary find, and since it was a tree of hitherto unknown species, Professor Woodlouse gave it a name of a learned sound, being none other than that of Professor Bullfrog, translated into the ancient Mastodon language. for it had always been the custom with discoverers to perpetuate their names and honor themselves by this sort of connection with their discoveries. Now, Professor Field Mouse, having placed his sensitive ear to the tree, detected a rich, harmonious sound issuing from it. This surprising thing was tested and enjoyed by each scholar in turn, and great was the gladness and astonishment of all. Professor Woodlouse was requested to add to and extend the tree's name so as to make it suggest the musical quality which it possessed, which he did, furnishing the addition anthem singer, done into the mastodon language. But this time Professor Snail was making some telescopic inspections. He discovered a great number of the trees extending in a single rank, with wide intervals in between, as far as his instrument would carry both southward and northward. He also presently discovered that all these trees were bound together near their tops by 14 great ropes, one above another, which ropes were continuous from tree to tree, as far as his vision could reach. This was surprising. Chief Engineer Spider ran aloft and soon reported that these ropes were simply a web hung up there by some colossal member of his own species, for he could see its prey dangling here and there from its strands in the shape of mighty shreds and rags that had a woven look about their texture, and were no doubt the discarded skins of prodigious insects which had been caught and eaten. And then he ran along one of the ropes to make a closer inspection, but felt a small sudden burn on the soles of his feet, accompanied by a paralyzing shock, wherefore he let go and swung himself to the earth by a thread of his own spinning, and advised all to hurry at once to camp, lest the monster should appear and get as much interested in the savants as they were in him and his works. So they departed with speed, making notes about the gigantic web as they went. And that evening the naturalist of the expedition built a beautiful model of the colossal spider, having no need to see it in order to do this, because he had picked up a fragment of its vertebra by the tree, and so knew exactly what the creature looked like, and what its habits and its preferences were, by this simple evidence alone. He built it with a tail, teeth, 14 legs, and a snout, and said it ate grass, cattle, pebbles, and dirt with equal enthusiasm. Strange way to talk about humans, right? This animal was regarded as a very precious addition to science. It was hoped a dead one might be found to stuff. Professor Woodlouse thought that he and his brother scholars, by lying hid and being quiet, might maybe catch a live one. He was advised to try it, which was all the attention that was paid to his suggestion. The conference ended with the naming the monster after the naturalist, since he, after God, had created it, and improved it, mayhap, muttered the tumblebug, who was intruding again according to his idle custom and his unappeasable curiosity. And 14, the separated letters in the Quran, those 29 chapters that start with the verse that have separated letters, you got 14 of them. There's 30 verses, but this story kind of points out the sort of propensity that us humans have to look at stuff and say, well, as soon as genetic modification was available, humans were trying to do stuff. But there's been some pretty messed up things that have happened as a result. Part second, how the animals of the world completed their scientific labors. A week after the expedition camped in the midst of a collection of wonderful curiosities. These were a sort of vast caverns of stone that rose singly and in bunches out of the plain by the side of the river, which they had first seen when they emerged from the forest. These caverns stood in long, straight rows on opposite sides of the broad aisles that were bordered with single ranks of trees. The summit of each cavern sloped sharply both ways. Several horizontal rows of great square holes, obstructed by a thin shiny, transparent substance pierced the frontage of each cavern. Inside were caverns within caverns, and one might ascend and visit these minor compartments by means of curious, winding ways consisting of continuous regular terraces, raised one above another, and there were many huge, shapeless objects in each compartment which were considered to have been living creatures at one time, though now the thin brown skin was shrunken and loose, and rattled when disturbed. Spiders were here in great number, and their cobwebs stretched in all directions, and wreathing the great skinny dead together were a pleasant spectacle, since they inspired with life and wholesome cheer a scene which would otherwise have brought to mind only a sense of forsakenness and dissolution. Information was sought of these spiders, but in vain. They were of a different nationality from those with the expedition, and their language seemed but a musical, meaningless jargon. They were a timid, gentle race, but ignorant and heathenish worshippers of unknown gods. The expedition entailed a great detachment of missionaries to teach them the true religion, and in a week's time a precious work had been wrought among those darkened creatures. Not 3 families being by that time at peace with each other, or having a settled belief in any system of religion whatever. This encouraged the expedition to establish a colony of missionaries there permanently, that the work of grace might go on. Well, we all know what that's a reference to, but it's important to note that a lot of the differences are just material and psychological. By material culture, of course, we also include different languages. People so foolishly, if you say the word for God in Arabic, you're not talking about God, even if you're reading from the Bible. Okay. Or, if you pronounce Hebrew, which has no J's, you're not talking about God anymore. You have to say Jehovah. Okay. Or, Got or whatever. But let us not outrun our narrative. After close examination of the fronts of the caverns, and much thinking and exchanging of theories, the scientists determined the nature of these singular formations. They said that each belonged mainly to the old red sandstone period, and the cave fronts rose in innumerable and wonderfully regular strata high in the air, each stratum about 5 frog spans thick, and that in the present discovery lay an overpowering refutation of all received geology, for between every 2 layers of old red sandstone reposed a thin layer of decomposed limestone. So instead of there having been but one old red sandstone period, there had certainly been not less than 175, and by the same token it was plain that there had also been 175 floodings of the earth and depositings of limestone strata. The unavoidable deduction from which pair of facts was the overwhelming truth that the world, instead of being only 200,000 years old, was older by millions upon millions of years. And there was another curious thing. Every stratum of the old red sandstone was pierced and divided at mathematically regular intervals by vertical strata of limestone, upshootings of igneous rock through fractures in water formations were common. But here was the first instance where water-formed rock had been so projected. It was a great and noble discovery, and its value to science was considered to be inestimable. A critical examination of some of the lower strata demonstrated the presence of fossil ants and tumblebugs, the latter accompanied by their peculiar goods, with high gratification. The fact was enrolled upon the scientific record, for this was proof that these vulgar laborers belonged to the first and lowest orders of created beings, though at the same time there was something repulsive in the reflection that the perfect and exquisite creature of the modern uppermost order owed its origin to such ignominious beings through the mysterious laws of development of species. The tumblebug, overhearing this discussion, said he was willing that the Venice of these new times should find what comfort they might in their wise-drawn theory, since, as far as he was concerned, he was content to be of the old first families and proud to point back to his place among the old original aristocracy of the land. Enjoy your mushroom dignity stinking of the varnish of yesterday's veneering since you like it. He said, suffice it for tumblebugs that they come out of a race that rolled their fragrant spheres down the solemn aisles of antiquity and left their imperishable works proclaimed in the old red sandstone to proclaim it to the wasting centuries as they file along the highway of time. Oh, take a walk, said the chief of the expedition with derision. The summer passed and winter approached. In and about many of the caverns were what seemed to be inscriptions. Most of the scientists said they were not. Said they were inscriptions. A few said they were not. The chief philologist, Professor Woodlouse, maintained that they were writings done in a character utterly unknown to scholars and in a language equally unknown. He had ordered his artists and draftsmen to make facsimiles of all that were discovered, and had set himself about finding the key to the hidden tongue. In this work he had followed the method which had always been used by decipherers previously. That is to say, he placed a number of copies of inscriptions before him and studied them both collectively and in detail. To begin, he placed the following copies together: the American Hotel, the Shades, Boats for Hire Cheap, Billiards, the A1 Barbershop, Keep Off the Grass, Cottages for Rent during the watering season, For Sale Cheap, Meals at All Hours, No Smoking, Union Prayer Meeting, 4 p.m., the Waterside Journal, Telegraph Office, Try Brendreth's Pills, For Sale Cheap, For Sale Cheap. At first, it seemed to the professor that this was a sign language, and that each word was represented by a distinct sign. Further examination convinced him that it was a written language and that every letter of its alphabet was represented by a character of its own. He finally decided that it was a language which conveyed itself partially by letters and partially by signs or hieroglyphics. This conclusion was forced upon him by the discovery of several specimens of the following nature. He observed that certain inscriptions were met with in greater frequency than others, such as For Sale Cheap, Billiards, St. 1860, X, Kino, Ale on Draught. Naturally, then these must have been religious maxims. But this idea was cast aside by and by as the mystery of the strange alphabet began to clear itself. In time, the professor was enabled to translate several inscriptions with considerable plausibility. Though not to the perfect satisfaction of all the scholars, still he made constant and encouraging progress. Finally, a cavern was discovered with these inscriptions upon it, and, now, it mentioned valuable to science. Well, science is, per se, the objective facts. Wisdom, you could say, is use of that, but value is a bit more subjective than that. Certain reactions, maybe not.